Our next speaker is Jennifer Norton. She's a Senior Data Analyst in the Department of Population Health at New York University Grossman School of Medicine. Her main interest is to analyze and communicate data findings that support and inform public health programs and policy. Dr. Norton joined NYU in 2017 after working for more than 10 years at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Many colleagues have come to know her as a data person, given her interest in using high quality data and methods to inform public health action. Dr. Norton holds a BA in geography from SUNY Geneseo, MS in epidemiology from the University of Buffalo, and PhD in epidemiology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Jennifer, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Anna. It is really so wonderful to be here with you all today to talk about some findings about self-reported driving behaviors. And before I begin, I do really want to thank my colleagues, Anna Caffarelli, Lawrence Fung, Wendy Dang, and Catherine Staten at the New York City Health Department for their contributions to this work. So this audience is very well versed in traffic safety. If I can figure out how to advance my slides, we'll move along. There we go. So let me just briefly mention that traffic crashes are a leading cause of preventable injury death in New York City, and that factors such as speeding and distracted driving can contribute to crashes and their severity. We also know from previous work that the interaction between individual behaviors and the environment has had proven success in reducing motor vehicle deaths. And we see that when we look at traffic safety through the lens of a public health socio-ecological model. And we can see that structures and policies such as speed limits and the consistent enforcement of those laws can influence driving behavior. We also know that aspects of the built environment, including road design and the timing and placement of traffic signals, can influence driving behaviors. Another element that's really critical here is the social environment. And that can include social norms around speeding. Is it socially acceptable to speed? Are you speeding or are you going with the flow of traffic? So there are so many elements to that and that really influences how an individual will drive. So all of these behaviors and these choices really happen in a context. And if we take a moment, I do want to tie this back because I do really think that the Vision Zero model of engineering and enforcement and education and legislation really aligns with this conceptualization. So the next few slides and the rest of this presentation is really going to focus a little bit about describing some individual behaviors, but please know that we do really see these as being influenced by this larger concept. So we have some surveillance questions. We wanted to know who drives in New York City. We also wanted to know what the prevalence of speeding was, and what is the prevalence of messaging while driving. And for each of these questions, we wanted to look at changes between 2015 and 2019, and also dive in a little bit more to really understand some of the demographic and geographic characteristics. So we used a public health data source, which is the New York City Community Health Survey. And this is a survey, it's a population-based telephone survey that's been conducted since 2002. And we use data from the years 2015 and 2019 to help address some of these questions. Just a little note about sample size. So in 2015, about 10,000 adults answered the survey, including about 4,000 drivers. In 2019, only a subset of respondents received the questions about driving. So the sample size is a little bit smaller, about 4,000 overall, including 1,900 drivers. But one special note about these data is that they're actually weighted to be representative of the New York City adult population. So for our driving behaviors, there were 3 different questions that were asked. For the construct of driving, we had a question about, in the past 30 days, on how many days did you drive a car or motor vehicle in New York City? And responses could range from 0 days to 30 days. For the construct of speeding, the question was asked, in the past 30 days, when you drove in New York City, how often did you drive 10 miles per hour or more over the posted speed limit? And responses there varied from often to never. For the construct of messaging while driving, the question was, in the past 30 days, when you drove in New York City, how often have you read or sent a text message or email while you were driving? And again, the responses were often to never. One special note, in 2019, the questions were worded just slightly differently. Instead of saying in New York City, the question was phrased about when you drove in one of the 5 boroughs. So for the analysis of these data, because this is a complex survey, we used SAS Callable Sudan to account for that survey design. And we just computed basic descriptive statistics, such as percentages and 95% confidence intervals. And we used t-tests to examine differences between groups and across years. So a couple of results. Let's start with who drives in New York City. There's a lot on this slide, but I'll walk through some of these key findings here. But this just shows big picture how the driving prevalence was actually similar between 2015 and 2019. About 41% of adults drove in New York City in 2015 and about 43% drove in 2019. And so the graphs are showing how the distribution of driving prevalence differed by different demographic characteristics. So if we start with the graph on the top left, that's by age group, we see very similar patterns between these 2 years, and that adults ages 25 to 44 and 45 to 64 were more likely to drive than younger adults and older adults. Moving along to sex, we see that about half of males drove a car compared to about a third of females. Moving along to race ethnicity, we see that driving a car was more common among white adults than adults of other race ethnicities. Moving down to the bottom row, and these findings will not shock anybody, that adults living in Staten Island were more likely to drive than adults living in other boroughs. About 3/4 of adults living in Staten Island drove compared to about 1/4 of adults in Manhattan. We also saw some associations in driving prevalence by educational attainment, where adults with a college education were more likely to drive than adults with less than a high school education. And similarly for household poverty, we saw wealthier adults were more likely to drive than adults living in poorer households. We also had the opportunity to look at not just did anyone drive, but how often were people driving? And so the graph on the left shows the frequency of the days that drivers drove a vehicle in the past 30 days. And the bar on top is findings from 2015, and the one on the bottom is 2019. And you can see that the findings were pretty similar. There was really not a huge change between these 2 years in terms of the frequency of driving. About half of adults were driving at least 20 days if they drove. Sorry, adult drivers were driving at least 20 days, with about 40% driving every day. The graph on the right shows some findings in daily driving by borough of residence. And again, not surprising at all, but I think that really does sort of highlight how drivers in Manhattan are less likely to drive every day than drivers in other boroughs, which is likely influenced by public transportation options. So now for some findings about self-reported speeding and self-reported messaging while driving. So first, some high-level findings. This graph shows the self-reported frequency of speeding among New York City drivers in these 2 years, in 2015 and 2019. And again, you'll see that they're very, very similar. There was essentially no change in the frequency of speeding in New York City over this time period. And that the other thing that's really notable is that speeding is really common. About 2 out of 3 drivers self-reported speeding. When we look at self-reported messaging while driving, we see a slightly different pattern, where there was actually an increase in self-reported messaging while driving between these 2 years. 19% of drivers reported messaging while driving in 2015 compared to 29% in 2019. But we can also see that that difference was really largely driven by those reporting rarely. It's still, those drivers reporting often messaging is still relatively low, about 2 or 3%. Now, these next few slides are set up the same way, so I just want to take a second and just orient everybody about what's going on here. The graphs on the left are going to show the prevalence of speeding by different demographic characteristics. And the graph on the right will show the prevalence of messaging while driving. And so this slide is highlighting age group, and subsequent slides will show the differences by other demographic characteristics. So if we start with speeding, what we see right off the bat is this increase in self-reported speeding among our youngest drivers, those 18 to 24 years old. We also note, if we go to the graph on the right, a pretty strong association between age and self-reported messaging while driving, which is probably, again, not unexpected, but still rather striking. What we also note is that for every age group except for the older adults, messaging while driving has increased in the other ages. Looking at differences in by sex, we saw that in 2015, the prevalence of self-reported speeding was higher for men than women, but in 2019, that difference was no longer statistically significant. Looking at messaging while driving increased for both men and women between 2015 and 2019, although rates by sex were similar. When we look at the results by race ethnicity, we saw that speeding was more common among white drivers than Latino and Asian drivers. And we also saw an increase in the prevalence of self-reported speeding among Asian drivers between 2015 and 2019. When we look at messaging while driving, we saw that there was an increase in messaging while driving across all race ethnicity groups, but that there was no difference between the groups. Moving on to borough of residence, we see, again, this might not be surprising, that speeding was more common among drivers living in Staten Island, although that increase was not statistically significant between 2015 and 2019. And looking at messaging while driving, there was an increase in messaging while driving among drivers living in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. I think notably the Manhattan one sort of stuck out to me. About 17% of Manhattan drivers in 2015 reported messaging while driving compared to 36% in 2019. And this is my last results slide. And this highlights the findings by wealth. And what we see is that there's actually those drivers living in wealthier households are 1.5 times more likely to self-report speeding than drivers living in poorer households. And similarly, drivers living in wealthier households are more likely to report messaging while driving as well. So I just want to sit with a minute with this result. And I'm not sure how many were able to attend Julia's wonderful presentation, but I think she started to raise some of these questions as well about what is the impact of sort of this fixed monetary fine as a disincentive to not speed. And so sorry, my phone's about to ring in a second. I really apologize for that. I don't know how to turn that off. Anyway, but I think it does beg the question. Really sorry. I'm just gonna hang up on this person. Well, that's lovely. Anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, so it does beg the question of whether fixed monetary fines for speeding foster an unequal system of deterrence. So just some strengths and limitations to kind of these final 2 slides. I think these data really complement some other findings that are out there and really contribute to this toolkit in understanding driving and driving behaviors. We are really able to get deep down into some demographic characteristics that really aren't found in other administrative or enforcement data sets. There are some limitations. Obviously, the potential for social desirability bias in self-reported data is well known, although we would expect that these results would actually be underestimated. Now, I've talked a lot about the socio-ecological framework and the importance of the built environment in kind of shaping behaviors, but we weren't able to collect any information about road type or road condition or road use and sort of understanding where speeding or messaging is happening. And similarly, we didn't collect any information about vehicle technology or hands-free messaging that might impact, either facilitate the kind of voice-free messaging, which is still a distraction, or apps that are now on people's phones that say, hey, I'm driving right now, I can't answer this. We also didn't look at these behaviors for younger adults or teens. So just in my last wrap up, I just want to highlight some really key findings that speeding is still common among New York City adults. There was an increase in messaging while driving that was seen across almost every group. And in particular, younger adults and wealthier drivers are more likely to self-report speeding and self-report messaging while driving. And I think really what this underscores is that understanding these behaviors behind the wheel can impact road safety for all. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn this over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I didn't even have to give you a time check because you were precisely on time.